fitness enthusiasts and ultimate Frisbee aficionados to the TOBU Fitness Podcast. Your guide to elevating your game and mastering the art of ultimate Frisbee through the lens of strength and conditioning. Whether you're a seasoned player or just stepping onto the field for the first time, this podcast is your one-stop destination for unlocking your true potential. This is the TOBU Fitness Podcast with your host, certified strength and conditioning coach, Justin Shelby.
Before we get started, I've got some quick announcements I want to make. As you guys know, I do one-on-one coaching, I do consultations, but now I'm going to start offering standalone training programs pretty soon, which is some pretty exciting stuff. If you're interested in being added to a VIP early access group to some of these programs, so this will get you early access to the programs as well as the programs at a discounted rate. You can fill out the survey that's in my bio. If you follow me on Instagram, check that out. The link in my bio is going to take you to the survey. It's also going to be down in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it's going to be down in the description. But that survey takes about 2 minutes. If you wouldn't mind filling that out, that helps me out, and then it gets you access to that VIP group that's going to have a lot of great benefits. All right, let's get into the show. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 5. Today is going to be a very fun one. We're talking a lot about how to train throughout the entire season. So that's obviously a topic that a lot of people think about, and there's a ton of detail in that. So I think this is going to be a really good episode if you're thinking about how can I do my own training, how should I do my team's training. A lot of good knowledge nuggets are going to be in this one. And because this is such an important topic, I wanted to bring on somebody that I've talked to a lot about this, somebody that knows a lot about this. This is Andrew Calvert, my first ever guest on the podcast as well. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Yeah. So little background about me and Andrew. We were teammates last year on a team called Firefly. So that was my first ever club season. Me and Andrew really didn't talk that much at the beginning of the season.
Oops.
We were joking a little bit before this that we kind of became friends over Element. So drink Element if you're interested in electrolytes, link in bio, quick plug there. But
shameless.
Yeah. But Andrew, I guess tell us a little bit about your background so people know who you are.
Yeah, so I have a background in strength and conditioning for one thing. So that was what I studied in college. I got my degree in kinesiology from Texas Tech, Reckham. Prior to that, I was interested in ultimate Frisbee, and throughout college, I played with Tech's club team. So kind of back in the Carson Wilder, Kyle Henke days, it was super fun. I got to be a part of their strength and conditioning aspect to the team as well. But more critically for, I think, kind of the context of this conversation, while I was playing Ultimate in college, and then since then, I was also working with strength and conditioning staff at Texas Tech. And so I was a certified strength and conditioning specialist. And while I have changed careers since then, that is still my passion. I love health and wellness. I love all things periodization, which is something that we'll talk about within this. So just kind of the concepts of how do we train maximally for increasing our capacity in life in general. And so specifically here, when Justin and I were talking about this, or is it TOBU? I don't know. Do we go TOBU, Justin?
Whatever.
Our esteemed host here. When we were chatting about these things, it was just this conversation that we've had constantly of like, how do ultimate players get better at ultimate through more intelligent training throughout the entire year? And then how do we take that year and break it down into multiple years and multiple seasons and not just look at it as each club season, how do I play well in those first few tournaments and then just stay healthy enough to play at sectionals, regionals, and nationals. And so within that, yeah, my interest in like even just training and how we structure training goes back to high school. I ran track and cross country. And so those 2 seasons are in the fall and spring times respectively. And at the school I went to, the cross country coach was the same coach as the track and field team. It was a small school. We had, maybe 30 or 40 folks on the team. And because it was a cross-country coach that also coached track, and yet I ran shorter distance events, it was not ideal to have a cross-country view for learning how to run sprints, or even just like the 400 or the 800 or the half mile. So within that, my sophomore year, my coach gave me the green light to just figure out my own training myself. And that was what actually sparked my interest in kinesiology entirely, was to figure out, like, as a high school kid at least, like, how do I even make myself good enough to run these track and field events that I'm not equipped for yet? Like, I might have talent, but how do I maximize that talent and that ability? And so I had to really dig into the weeds on just programming in general, and that term periodization is kind of what we're hitting on a lot today. So it's something that I've just been interested in for a minute. It's kind of like a weird nerd thing. And once again, like it translates into a lot of stuff, which is what we'll get into. So yeah, here we are.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like we've talked a lot about my injuries and your injuries and stuff. Like you're somebody that's helped me kind of bounce ideas off with my own injuries. Because I'm sure you can relate, like when you're talking to a client or you're talking to somebody about their injuries, you're rational, you're able to think. But then when it's your own injury, all that logic goes out the window because it's like, how do I just want this to be better. So you kind of empathize with people. But yeah, you're somebody that I've been able to kind of bounce ideas off of. And yeah, we've had a lot of these conversations before. So it's about time we finally got one into recording and out there to people. So you mentioned periodization. Yeah, that's what we'll talk about a lot today. Yes, do you want to go into like how you would define periodization, kind of what that is?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of very technical ways you could describe it, and it sounds like a big, weird word. But it's really just the idea of having different seasons in life, in your training, in your sport. And so periodization from a strength and conditioning perspective has to do with how do you make the body as strong and conditioned as you can be throughout an entire year, which requires doing different things at different stages of the year, and then recognizing when you need to be the most performant at any given point. And so when we have that reverse timeline to work back from, in this case, if you're an ultimate player and you're thinking about your most important tournaments of the season or several seasons throughout the year, it's the idea of which tournaments do you want to ensure you're going to perform the absolute best in. In track and field, it is what are the races you want to be the fastest in or to have the best performance in if you're a jumper, sprinter, whatever the case may be. For football, it's obviously playoff season. We want to be as performant as we can be for that. But it's just this idea of how do we structure our training, how do we structure our lives around being as sharp as we need to be for the most important competitions.
Right. And I think like that kind of leads into something we've talked about before that's kind of a controversial topic. I'll say like this one triggers some people, but I talked about this in the past and it's like I think ultimate players oftentimes play too much ultimate. And sometimes when I say that, people are like, "Oh yeah, you just got to take Sundays off and you just got to take rest days." But it's a lot deeper than that. Like, can you kind of go into some of your thoughts there of like how ultimate players can maybe cut back on ultimate, why playing too much might be a bad thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should preface this by reminding everyone that I'm not an ulti junkie by any means. I do not play year round. I'm of the opinion that I can play for a few months of the year and get a lot of joy out of it and perform really well during that season and then back off from it and still come back and be as performant as I need to be. But within that, I personally don't play ultimate year round. I personally will only play very intensely for a few months out of the year. And I actually got injured this past season. I'd been nursing a stress fracture on my left heel. So I didn't even play this season. But you and I have even talked about, like, as I've been training and doing strength and conditioning stuff in the meanwhile, I could probably go back into it and do some tests such as, jumping or sprints, and within a couple weeks get back up to a certain playable level. And so within that, I think that we oftentimes, as ultimate players especially, have a culture of playing too much because it is just so fun and we just want to keep getting after it. But the reality is the more you play, you're actually diminishing your maximum capacity because we overexert ourselves and we increase our risk of injury when we play too much. And when you even look at players at the highest levels of ultimate, such as in the AUDL, even very high level club players, like they spent a decade or so probably playing arguably too much. But as they progress in their careers, so many of them, if you were to ask them how many days a week do you play intensely, like really at the high maximal intensity, it's not going to be every day. And they can't possibly do that. Whereas I think a lot of club players and more of kind of the less elite, the more mid-range, which is the most populous of ultimate players in general, we spend so much time playing because it's so fun. And you can get away with that to an extent. But I think that when we're talking about trying to maximize our capacity and our performance, there's a limit that we hit if we play too much too frequently.
It's like the analogy I've kind of used is like day two of a tournament, even though you're going at 100%, it's naturally less than what you were doing day one, just because the fatigue adds up. And that's like a very extreme example. But if you then take that to every single week of every single month throughout the entire year, it's like whatever your 100% is, it's either naturally going to back down because you're tired, or your body's going to be like, hey, let's just go through cruise control so we can make it through an entire year. There's a lot of stuff that kind of ends up happening that ends up taking away from intensity. And then, like we know, like intensity is definitely the most important thing, kind of in
Right.
ultimate.
Well, and even just, if we were to really zoom out here and think about this in terms of other seasons, like as we see seasons progress in nature, there's only one or two growing seasons, right? Like generally speaking, depending on where you are, usually not Texas, but elsewhere in areas that have real seasons, the springtime is when things grow the most vibrantly, and like when you get that neon green pop after the winter lull. But before that, you got to remember that, like, everything was resting all winter long. Like everything was doing nothing by way of growing. If anything, it all dies back. And before that, you usually have the fall season where leaves are coming off the trees. They're falling, if you will. Things are cooler. There might be some greenery, some growth, but like it's in prep for the rest of the winter. And then the summertime, it's just like a harsh time, right? Like summer is oftentimes, especially in Texas, just so dry and desolate. And yet right before that was springtime, right? Where everything was green and vibrant. So like even in nature, we see this progression of there being an ebb and a flow to the seasons out of necessity for how organisms function best. And so as humans, we have a lot in our society and our technology that allows us to just go, go, go all the time. And so to, zoom out and imagine, like, if we couldn't actually play ultimate or whatever sport year round, and we actually had to phase ourselves out a little bit, what would it look like? And if we need examples of that, once again, I think that nature gives us a lot of impetus for at least examining it and thinking through it. And a lot of ancient prophets and scholars have talked about seasons, and there's a reason for that.
Totally. I guess to make it really simple, it's like that winter time is the off season when everybody's hibernating, and then everything else is go time, which I guess kind of leads into the off season. My team didn't qualify for nationals, probably like 99% of club teams out there. Some people didn't make it to regionals. So for a lot of people, we're in the off season now. So if we were to talk like really generally, what are some principles when you're thinking about off season training?
Yeah, great question. I'm usually thinking through, once again, working in reverse from the most important tournaments of the season or even most important games. Like we can't map that out perfectly in Ultimate, but we generally are going to know what time of year that we're going to have our sectionals or our nationals or regionals tournaments, right? We know when the most important ones of the season generally are hitting. And so working in reverse from that, I want to think about how do I maximize my capacity or a client's capacity to the fullest, so that by the time that really critical moment or sets of moments, which in this case is a weekend, right? Like by the time these really important weekends come around, how am I going to perform my best? How am I going to be the least likely to get injured? How am I going to be as endurant as possible so that I have the stamina to go hard an entire weekend long, both Saturday and Sunday? And by game 3 on Sunday, I'm in that championship bracket and I still feel good enough to keep putting out at that performance level. So I want to be thinking about increasing my capacity in the off season. And I know you probably want to get into specifics of that, but like holistically, in concept at least, we want to think about how do we build the most capacity possible that lets us peak as best as we can for the important ones.
Right. Yeah. An analogy I've used to explain that is like, if you're building a pyramid, just the wider you go, the higher you can end up going. If I don't spend that much time building a good base, if I don't spend that much time building capacity, I can do all the things I want to peak, but it's not going to be that high just because I haven't spent that time in the off season building up that capacity. So like, what are some things that you go to build up that capacity?
Yeah, usually as soon as, for instance, sectionals last year for me and the team I was playing on, as soon as that was over, I took a week to basically do nothing, to rest, recover. And then I just almost immediately started doing longer runs. Like I was running a little bit during the season, but I just took the opportunity to like go out and crush some mileage. And I used to be a runner. I don't necessarily love it all the time these days, but when I do it, I want to do it with intent. And so I started out by doing, and I normally would recommend this too, of just like do more at a lower intensity. So if that's playing, like go out and just play at a lower intensity, like enjoy just the fun of being as sharp as you're going to be with your throws. Things are going to be as crispy as they're ever going to be coming out of those peak tournaments. And hopefully, as you might be feeling beat up, you can just take that time to recover. But if you're doing a lot at a low intensity for a few weeks, especially coming out of that, it's kind of that reacclimation phase where additionally, if you're starting to lift weights again, which I know we'll get into that in a little bit, but as you start to lift weights again, even, you probably haven't been lifting as many weights as frequently as you once were. Like if you're training year round, you probably weren't lifting as much towards the end of your season. And so you can take that time to rebuild that skill set of lifting weights, because lifting weights is a skill. Strength training is a skill. And as with any skill, you got to knock off the rust sometimes. And so if we're going back to building a base, you have to practice those things that you're trying to build into the base of the pyramid.
Totally. And do you think then that lower weights are kind of better? So like higher reps, it sounds like, with going into building capacity, or heavier weights, like how do you kind of structure that?
Yeah, I focus a lot on, number one, recognizing that the farther we are from those really important peaking weeks or months of the seasons, the more volume I can get away with on my lifting. And so I'm talking about volume, that's just weight times reps. And obviously, if we're doing more sets, we're doing more overall volume. Over time, if we increase the weight, we can increase volume that way as well. But generally speaking, this is the time of the season where if I am doing squats again, for instance, or even something like a dumbbell bench press, like very general, non-specific strength training, where I'm just overall getting my body stronger, I'll be doing 4 or 5 sets of 10 to 12 reps, like accumulating a lot of volume, double digits on the reps, probably getting sore as shit for the most part, but that's okay because it doesn't matter if I'm sore and I go out and play pickup, right? I'm probably not having a lot of practice time. Hopefully I'm not really practicing for much of anything with Ultimate at this stage of the season. And so with that, I can put more of my energy that would normally be spent on playing into lifting weights, into growing more muscle, putting that mass on perhaps that, sure, might decline later on, but also builds a good base from which I can get stronger later in the year.
Real quick, want to talk about the sponsor of today's episode, Breakmark Ultimate. Once again, it's them. They helped my club team, Alamode, out with some jerseys that looked absolutely awesome. And they're helping me out with some TOBU Fitness merch as well. So if you're interested in that, link in bio or down in the show notes. But they've got a new deal running now. So if you're a high school team, if you're a college team, but wherever you are, if you're interested in jerseys, I think you'll be interested in this deal here. So when you order a light, a dark, and a pair of shorts, you're going to get a free reversible and a free 5-panel hat included in that. But it starts at $85 for the cheapest bundle and then goes up from there. But you get a light, a dark, and a pair of shorts, a free reversible, and a free hat. Definitely a deal that you want to check out. Let's get back to the show. For me, I think the big thing is like we're doing the stuff that in season would end up being redundant. If we're playing so much Ultimate, that's so much volume on our legs, so much jumping and cutting volume, that our muscles just are tired, they're fatigued. So then on top of that, if you're adding four to 5 sets of 10 reps, that's a ton. But if we're not playing as much Ultimate, then this is the time where we can afford to do that. We can be more sore, like you're saying, because we've just got time on our hands. And then back to the conditioning thing, it's the same thing where if I'm playing a ton of Ultimate in season, if I've got practices, if I've got games, I'm already getting most of my conditioning that way. So we don't need to, I don't need to eat a very, very balanced diet and then also take a bunch of supplements, right? That's redundancy there. But yeah, in the off season, if I'm not playing as much, then yeah, I can supplement with a lot more of that cardio. So yeah. And I think another thing too that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is I've always thought of it as it's nice to kind of change up the stimulus a little bit more. Like if you're in season, everything is about intensity, like I said earlier. So you're probably doing some heavier weights. You're probably doing some more intense plyometrics and jumping and cutting and stuff. But over time, your body kind of gets like desensitized to that a bit. It's like caffeine. If you at first when you have coffee, you're buzzing, but after a while that goes away. And I think in the off season, if we spend some time away from that and then kind of get back to that, you start to get some better benefits. Like, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to if you've ever gone out and tried throwing with your offhand or just doing funky throws, like throws that you have no business doing in a game, unless you're that specific player that's going to do that no matter what anyone says. Regardless, it's just this different part of our brain that we end up using for those throws. And then we go back to our normal flicks and our backhands and our normal pivots, our normal release points, and like even just normal catching stuff. Like I think the Kung Fu throwing drills do a lot of this where you're throwing really funky things sometimes in a really specific way. Same thing with like how we catch. And then you go back to the normal basics, the fundamentals, and it's just so easy, right? Like it just clicks. And I think that our training is the exact same way where our bodies, like they crave that novelty. Like we crave that variety. Once again, seasons, right? Like nature craves variety. It needs rest. It needs restoration. And I think we're the exact same way, where like we just need to do something different. It's like same shit, different days, not always productive. And so it can just be that novelty of like, you're not spending as much time on the field running around. And so your lower body all of a sudden might get a whole lot out of lifting some weights and doing heavy squats and deadlifts and things like that. But if we, were to continue to try to do that while, like you were saying, playing at a high intensity all throughout the season, there's not enough energy in our systems to do that, right? And so like we take this opportunity to just do something different that's fun, that's different. If you don't like lifting weights, then, there are other things you could be doing in the off season as well that would still qualify as like the periodized training that allows you to peak later on.
Yeah, and kind of to your point there, something I like to do in the off season a lot is, like you said, changing up and doing different lifts. I think with a lot of people, like we often look at the squat and we look at the deadlift and these heavy movements, and it's like we're getting stronger with them, but we're not necessarily always getting stronger. Sometimes we're just getting better at the skill of that movement. And then when you kind of change it up and you do single leg stuff, or you attack the legs and the core and stuff at different ways, you start to realize that there's some strength deficiencies there. Like even if you have a very, very strong squat, you could have a very bad single leg squat just because you're skilled at the squat. So kind of what are some like big differences you might do in the off season, or some different stuff that you might like throw in that you wouldn't do in season?
Yeah, during the off season, I oftentimes, and I mean, this is how I would structure things for anyone that's trying to perform in any sport, like even if it's just lifting weights. If you just want to get stronger at powerlifting, for instance, and all you're technically getting judged on is squat, bench, deadlift, like same principle would apply, where I would say that if you have an opportunity to go really heavy on more single leg type stuff, or like we refer to as unilateral, I know a lot of the content that you present generally is your favorite for training specific stuff for ultimate, like it has to do with single legs, right? And so a lot of times I'll use that off season where I'm far out from the peak tournaments and events and things such as that. And I'll just like focus on really heavy lunges, for instance, where I might even put a barbell on my back, and I'll just focus on getting really strong in a certain rep range. And I'll start with sets of 10 to 12 reps and kind of work down. And as I get stronger and the weight goes up, I'm doing sets of 6 to 8 or 3 to 5 reps per leg or something like that. But basically just taking the opportunity to get really good at something that's not the same foundational pattern, but it's a little bit different to get me out of those normal grooves. In the same way that if, we're learning how to throw, like working on our hucks, even when we're not a handler, like it's usually a good thing, right? Like it makes us better at the shorter stuff too, to an extent. Might not go the other way where the short stuff makes us better at the hucks, right? But like there's usually some way that novelty and getting really good at something new that's adjacent to the thing that we're trying to train for, whether that be strength, endurance, or whatever, it's all good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. That actually just kind of reminds me of something the other day. So I'm in graduate school getting my master's in kinesiology, and one of my exams, they said like, what is the most sports specific exercise for a runner? And it was like a bunch of different options, and the answer was lunges. And I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, my academia within kinesiology ended before I got to a master's level, and that was intentional. That was not necessarily because I thought that it was useless so much as I do find a lot of times in academia, we try to like, I think in the world, not just academics, but we try to just say what is the absolute best single exercise for something. And there are absolute truths in the world, don't get me wrong, different conversation entirely. But within finding absolute statements, a lot of times we put something into a box that doesn't require being in a box. And I think saying a best exercise makes me ask, so what? Or like, what, like, for what? Like, so what? You think it's the best exercise? Why is that? And how is that? And what does that even mean? Is it the best exercise for getting strong at lunging, or for lengthening our hip flexor, right? Like, what are we trying to accomplish with the lunge? Or as a runner, why are we getting stronger? Do I actually need stronger quads or stronger hamstrings? Do I have that imbalance? Like minutia of it that makes it such that question would really bug me on an exam.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's like when you ask the question of best exercise, and yeah, this is something I've tackled a lot too. It's like, it's not binary, like it's either
Right.
0 or 1, yes or no. Like, and I think if it was that simple and there were just the best exercises, like then we'd have a lot more faster people. We'd have a lot more people that are not injured, because it's like, oh, we have the answer for the best thing. But like clearly, because we still have all these problems, it probably tells us that it's not as clear cut as we think.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, I could absolutely tell you what's probably not a best exercise for running, right? Like, I'm not going to tell you the bench press is the best exercise for running. Like, we could probably not argue about that even. Like, that would be a very simple conversation. So I think that it's easier to look at that which is not going to be hyper productive for what we're trying to accomplish in the training and just eliminate those things and take those off entirely. And through elimination, like we can get to a better range of the things that are productive.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I like that. That thought process is nice. Yeah, I guess just to kind of transition here. So off season, doing some different stuff, building up good capacity. But then when we get closer to the season, there's this idea of peaking and like when should we be peaking? But even within peaking, I think the definition of that and the idea of that is still kind of misunderstood a bit. So do you want to kind of help us define what peaking is?
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but when I think of peaking, or if you just think of the term peak performance, we kind of think of like we've probably climbed a mountain to get somewhere, right? Like the peak of a mountain. To your pyramid analogy earlier, it requires a large base, right? It requires traveling up to the top of it. And once you're at the top, there's not as much surface area that we're working with. Like we have a very specific reason for being there. We're probably not exploring a lot of the area around it. Like we have a very defined purpose for where we are in that moment in time and place. So I just think of peaking as like, what's that moment for you in the season that matters most? And generally speaking, and Ultimate especially, there are going to be multiple seasons for this, right? Because you might have, if you're a club player, wanting to peak for those important tournaments around sectionals time and whatnot. However, you also had your tryouts before that season. So you probably needed to have peaked in some way, shape, or form for that. And usually that's a very specific thing, right? Like you know that you're going to go out and do your metrics and your measurables, like your high jump, your broad jump, your 40-yard dash, like all the things, the agility drills, like stuff that you can practice and get way better at. Do you need to be as good at those things to play well at sectionals as you were during tryouts? Maybe not. Like tryouts might have been one of the more competitive times of your season. So like there are different times in which we peak, but peaking is just like being ready for the important stuff essentially.
Yeah, it's the idea that like you can cycle through this cycle here multiple times if you want to, right? Yeah, because I think a lot of people are like so ready to be ready for tryouts that they peak and they get really good, but then it's like you come crashing down because you sacrificed a lot of stuff to kind of to get to that peak. So I guess like when we're thinking about peaking in multiple times kind of throughout the season, like how would that kind of look different for if I'm peaking like my conditioning versus if I'm trying to peak my athleticism, maybe like more strength and stuff like that?
I think generally leading up to tryouts, for instance, you can spend a lot of time building up a lot of endurance and a lot of strength simultaneously, simply because you're not playing as much Ultimate. You could, however, make poor decisions, go out and play way too much Ultimate, and then none of this matters. However, if you're not playing quite as much in those months leading up to it, so let's say, what would that be, from like maybe November until February, right? Like that's a solid 4-month stint where you could be doing a lot of conditioning and also a lot of strength work, like get really, really strong in some lifts as well. And then by the time you get to tryouts, like that's kind of your time to shine and like prove yourself you've made some progress, right? And like, you know, maybe a month before that, you want to be playing a lot more Ultimate, so you're getting sharp on the field, translating your endurance and your strength and your power into these components in a tryout setting. However, once you've built up that capacity, you can maintain that really effectively throughout the season with a minimal dose. And like that's something that we don't think about is like when we build the right capacity and have the right foundation of the pyramid, it stays there, right? Like it might diminish somewhat if we stopped working on it entirely, but we're going to maintain our endurance and our strength and our power if we're going out and playing high intensity Ultimate regularly enough in the season, which as we talked about, we are more than likely already doing that, maybe even too much. So point being, it's not that difficult, I think, to maintain throughout the season those things with a very minimal dose that we could apply.
Yeah, and I think like even in the off season, that's kind of important too. Like I know the way that social media structures it, and I'm guilty of this too, just because you got to kind of follow the formula a bit. But the idea of like level 1, level 2, and you've got to hit these progressions. But it's not like when you start the off season, you've got to start with all this level 1 stuff, and then like once you've passed level 1, you got to progress on to level 2. Like I've got to hit these certain weights so I can go from low weights to high weights. It's like, now you probably want to keep sprinting just a bit. Probably want to touch up with heavy weights just a bit, touch up on your explosiveness just a bit. It's just like you're saying, it doesn't take that much to maintain that stuff. So you can maybe do it once a week, once every other week, but if you're spending these 4 or 5 month periods not doing any sprints, not doing any jumps, and you just do a bunch of like bodybuilding type training, then you go back out there and sprint, like that might be kind of problematic.
Right.
But yeah, I think to your point, like, yeah, in season, like we can take all that stuff that we built in the off season and we can just kind of touch up on it. Like if you were doing, like you said, 4 to 5 sets in the off season, you can just do 1 to 2 to kind of maintain that strength, because you're not trying to continue to like pack on a bunch more strength, pack on a bunch more muscle. It's just, we've just got to touch up on that stuff there. So yeah, I think that's a really great point. And what do you think about then people that look at the in season as a way to make progress? Like, do you think there are opportunities for people to like continue to progress and get like much better, or how should kind of expectations look in season?
I guess it depends what we're talking about getting better at. Are you like thinking about skill specific things or endurance, or what are you thinking of?
Yeah, I think kind of like in the athleticism side of things, because I imagine you would agree that building skills in the off season or in season, sorry, should probably be like your biggest priority. And if you're playing a lot, if you're throwing a lot more with your teammates and stuff, like skills would naturally kind of progress. But imagine with like athleticism, that'd be a little different.
I think it is. Yeah. I mean, overall, I suppose it just depends on what is the thing that you're trying to build towards. Like throwing, like you said, skills, I guess like your chemistry, all these things definitely come together. I think athleticism overall too just naturally develops. And that's one of the beauties of this conversation, right? Is that if we're increasing our capacity in the off season, we're not increasing the specificity of our athleticism, right? But we are increasing the capacity that we have to be a better athlete and to be more performant. So within that, a lot of times the way we do that is to just get out there and play more. But if we build our base and our base gets bigger and stronger, we have more capacity to do that. And so point being, I think that the way our athleticism grows and changes and shifts into like in the season itself is largely dependent on how much capacity and base did we build otherwise. Do we give ourselves an opportunity to be the strongest we could be, to be as powerful as we could be, to be as resilient, right? From like an injury prevention standpoint, even like putting on muscle helps us be more resilient. Like our tendons getting stronger through the proper strength training makes us more resilient. Like all these things allow us then to very organically become better athletes in the season as we just go out and have fun. Like a lot of that fun factor, even in Ultimate, that comes out of like it just being such a great sport in that regard of just being enjoyable to play, a lot of that stuff just makes us better. You got that dog in you sometimes and you just want to go after it. And all of a sudden your body that's more ready than it was the past season to go and make that big play, like you're ready to do it. And you're just going to do it because it's fun. You're just an athlete doing athlete things.
Totally. And I think that brings up kind of a good point too, of like when you've got that bigger capacity, you've got that bigger base to handle more load, then soreness is generally going to go down too.
Right.
Like I get a lot of questions on Instagram like that. Like, what can I do to prevent soreness between day 1 and day 2 of a tournament? It's like, you're too late by then.
You're done.
You're done by then. It's like, it's what did you do beforehand to be able to handle 8 hours of playing and then wake up and then go do it again. There's not like some special stretch or massage technique that's going to take out all that soreness. Is your body able to handle that? And yeah, that comes from a ton of training beforehand.
Yeah, and you'll see this a lot with once again going back to track and field athletes, and this is true with like the Texas Tech folks that I worked with, as well as if you just look at any even like marathon runners, like whether they're doing short distances in the sprints in track and field or they're ultra endurance folks that are running marathons, like their off season includes so much more mileage than they would ever dare to do in season. And I'm talking about like accumulating 100+ miles in a given week. Like if you do the math on that, that's, double digit mileage every day and then some. They're not doing that throughout the season, but you can guarantee that when they get to those marathon distance events, if they are running that kind of stuff, their body is used to running so much mileage that 26.2 miles doesn't crush them. They're really maximized, even though it's such a long event. Like they've been doing more than was necessary building up to that, and so then in season they're able to actually, like their body can handle that. So to your point of soreness in days 1 and 2 of tournaments, you got to be working on building that capacity for your body to take that strain months in advance to it.
And I think something else that I've kind of liked too is when you build that capacity, then when you go into that more explosive stuff, that heavier stuff, like your body is able to recover a little quicker too. Like you don't want to be that guy that does like a 50-yard sprint and is gassed and needs 10 minutes to recover from that.
Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy. Build your capacity in the off season so that when you're doing this more intense stuff, like you're able to recover, you're able to get a lot more out of it. But yeah, a lot of players I talk to are often, they're surprised when I tell them that I actually recommend like lifting heavy in season. A lot of players think like, oh, lifting heavy, that's gonna make me injured. Like I'm gonna be in pain from doing that. Which if you're lifting heavy, if you're lifting anything and you're in pain, that's probably a good sign that you should probably stop lifting.
Agreed.
Or at least that, right? Or that weight or that exercise, whatever it is, right? But yeah, I generally think lifting heavy in the off season is good, and we both come from a traditional exercise science or kinesiology education background, where that's what they teach: lower weights in the off season, higher weights in season. And that low weight in the off season is to build up the capacity, like we've been talking about. But obviously, you don't want to just do a bunch of base building, capacity building all year round. So how would you kind of transition as we get closer to the season, as we want to peak into some of that heavier stuff?
Yeah, when we think about periodization overall, it's going from high volume, low intensity to high intensity, low volume, generally speaking. If we had beautiful whiteboard up here, we could like visualize that. But the idea being that as intensity goes up, there's an inverse relationship to the volume. And the whole point of capacity, like you were saying, is to build it up so that we can peak with it. And so if we've been doing the right work in the off season and building our capacity and our base properly for the pyramid, it's pretty simple in that the weights can keep going up throughout the season. Like we can drop our rep range once the season starts from those 10 to 12 or sets of 10 to 12 to maybe, we're only doing 2 to 3 sets, but there's 6 to 8 reps instead of 10 to 12. And as the season goes on, we can drop down to 2 to 3 sets of 5 or 2 to 3 sets of 3. You can usually get away with more sets of lower reps and still maintain things, if that makes sense. So like, for instance, if I'm doing 3 sets of 5, that's 15 total reps. I might want to do 3 sets of 4 if I increase the weights, and that would be 12 total reps, right? And then like maybe my next progression is 4 sets of 3. I can maybe do 5 sets of 2, something like that, right? Like if you do the math on it, our reps are still going down, but we're not like losing out on all that volume. The idea being that in season, once again, that low volume but higher intensity is actually a really great complement to the high intensity, the high volume overall that we're putting out on the field. We're doing a lot of sprinting. We're taking a lot of strain on those tournaments, especially when you have those tournaments that are like maybe not back-to-back weekends, but really close to it, where they're every couple weeks. And so the higher intensity, lower rep work that we do with really simple movements like a squat, deadlift, even a bench press or like a weighted pull-up or row or something like that, like all these fundamental patterns, we can get away with just doing higher weight for few reps. And within those few reps, we're still getting the right input to where our body is maintaining that strength. And when we go out on the field and we use that power that we also still have and like string it all together of jumping multiple times over, it's just a good complement overall to the overall strength curve itself.
Totally. Something you kind of touched on there is like when we're doing all this like sprinting and jumping and cutting and stuff, like not all of our training has to be like super, super specific to like always replicate every single thing exactly as we see it in Ultimate. Like sprinting, cutting, jumping at high intensities, like that's something that requires your entire body, right? Your like brain is sending signals to your muscles like we've got to go, we've got to fire very, very quickly. And like a squat's like, yes, we're building leg strength, yes, we're building overall lower body strength, but it's also just that like shock to the system and that shock to like your brain being like, yo, we've got to send these signals kind of in the same way. So like, right. Even though it's not one for one, like we're training the nervous system to produce very, very high intensities in the same way. So like you're saying, it's like, we don't have to play Ultimate and do all these intense things on the field and then go out and also do another field workout and a bunch of those to maintain it. So there's like things like heavy lifting where we can kind of get similar like overarching qualities that aren't just like always greasing the same grooves and like beating things down exactly the same way. So that's one of the reasons I've always liked higher output like power training or heavy lifting, just to kind of get that like nervous system kind of stimulus. And something else I always like to kind of think about it as like, what are the redundancies in the training, right? I don't want to have somebody go do a bunch of something. Like I don't want somebody to go eat a bunch of vitamin A and then I also prescribe them a vitamin A supplement, because that's the exact same thing, right? So like, what do you think are the biggest things that people aren't getting from playing the sport, I guess, outside of just heavy lifting, that like they can kind of supplement into their training?
So I think overall, most players are not going out and doing a maximal effort jump very often on the field. And if they are, they're probably a little bit fatigued or a lot of bit fatigued. It's pretty rare that we're just sitting down there cherry picking. If you are, that maybe that's okay, but it's probably not for the most part. And so within that, I think just like if you look at a game of Ultimate and you look at the things that go into being an athlete, like max strength and max power output are two things that are really critical to be a really athletic person, but they're not things that we get to do completely fresh in Ultimate. And so I think our training should just be supplementing that, right? Like I think a lot of the low intensity plyometrics, extensive plyometrics, I think is what you refer to them as, that you recommend to your clients. I recommend those to a lot of folks too. And like when I was working as a personal trainer, not with athletes, but with general population adults, we would use an agility ladder quite a bit, because that's something that most people are not using their feet for in that way most of the day. And I think on the inverse side of that, a lot of parents, for instance, are bending down and picking up a child. Like they're doing that pattern a lot. But on the flip side, like, maybe they don't need to, along those lines, they might not need to do that type of pattern within their weight training if I'm working with them. But they might need to do more of the things that they find themselves just not doing as regularly, that on the rare occasion they do go and try to pick up a child if they're not actually used to doing that. Like if they're an older individual that's a grandparent, maybe that doesn't have this child around them all the time, they might throw their back out doing that. And so all of a sudden, the thing that I want them to work on in their health and wellness training and those sessions is going to be much more geared towards preparing them for the unknown or preparing them for the thing they don't normally have preparation for. All that to say, to land this plane here, in Ultimate, we don't have a max effort lower body motion that we do fresh all the time. We don't have a lot of time spent doing upper body strength work. And yet sometimes we have that bid where we laid out and our arm took a lot of strain in a really funky way, that if we didn't have strong, healthy shoulders and chest and tricep musculature, like that shoulder complex might get blown up. And so I think we need to train for filling in the gaps of the things that are maybe unlikely to happen or to occur as regularly, but that set us up for when we do need to have that capacity.
Yeah, I like that, because I think with Ultimate, I think a lot of people separate it in their minds of I'm doing Ultimate and then I'm training for Ultimate, but Ultimate is training in a sense, right? It's still a physical activity. So like, yeah, like you said, like filling in the gaps is huge. I think to your point about like upper body training, I know UT's old track coach would recommend his sprinters before their race would do like very, very heavy bench press. Mm-hmm. So they would get that like quick nervous system kind of shock, and their brain was ready to go and their muscles ready to go, but they're not taxing their legs. So I thought that was kind of really cool. But yeah, I think upper body training is nice too, because then you're not as sore as your lower body training. If you were going to be sore, rather it be like your upper body be a little bit sore than your legs gassed and then trying to go out.
And that's that like brings up another good point too, of like, if you wanted to continue to lift weights during Ultimate, like you could spend more time doing upper body training than lower body, and it wouldn't be useless, but it would also be reducing that redundancy like you were talking about. And yet, like, once again, there are times where we do need our shoulders and our arms and our whole upper bodies to be as healthy as possible, so that we do have resiliency for like when that huck comes off at a funky angle, we don't blow out a rotator cuff. Like, it's rare, but it does happen that we injure that upper body musculature too. So once again, it could be a gap that we need to fill in to some extent.
And I think like how I've explained it too is like you don't jump that often, but when you jump, like your jump better be there. So
yeah, right.
You got to touch up on it. We've gone pretty extensively into like off season, in season, kind of how the structure over the entire year it would look. But I think what we haven't really talked about is how it might look different depending on the player's training age, right? Like a newer lifter, probably they could obviously benefit from doing something structured like this, but they could also get away with doing a lot more. Whereas if you If you're more experienced, you probably have to get a little bit more specific and detailed in what you're doing. So I guess starting with like a newer lifter, how might some of these principles be a little different? Like, how might you think about them a little bit differently?
Yeah, training age plays a huge role in your actual capacity and what your potential is. So a newer lifter, generally speaking, and for anyone that has gone through adolescence, you remember maybe that if you lifted any weights and ate any amount of food when you were a grown teenager, like you probably put on a little bit of muscle, you got bigger, you got taller, just easy. And you just had all this capacity before you, and it was really simple. Like you could just think about working out and you might get a little bit stronger. Same thing with Ultimate. Like any player that's done absolutely nothing with a disc in their hands before usually gets a lot better, a lot more quickly. Same thing with lifting. You can definitely get away with doing almost anything that's remotely intelligent in terms of the exercise selection. And you'll probably, if you've never done it before, get a lot stronger and a lot more competent with lifting. Once you get past those first few months of training, though, you do need to be more specific with it because your body doesn't respond as quickly to these adaptations, or it doesn't adapt as quickly, rather, to the stimulus you're given to it. So I think if you've never touched weights before, just starting with 3 sets of 10 on any given exercise, pick something for your upper body, like a pushing motion for your upper body, a pulling motion for upper body, and then like 2 exercises for your lower body, squats and lunges or squats and deadlifts, something like that. Do 3 sets of 10 on those exercises, do a little more weight each week, train it 2 times a week for a few weeks, see where you get in 8 weeks, and then go from there. That right there is super simple, but like that's the type of thing that over time you can iterate on. And for me, at least, and a lot of the clients that I have worked with or I still work with, I found that over time, my desire to introduce all the flashy Instagram things, like the types of exercises that play well by way of content, are not the things that I actually want to spend most of my time doing. I really want to spend most of my time focusing on the fundamentals and continuing to get better at those. And so once you build some kind of base and that skill set specifically, you do want to be specific in your exercise selection, and you do sometimes need to get thinking outside the box to keep progressing. But overall, the name of the game is not always progression, right? A lot of times it's just maintaining the capacity that we currently have throughout the season. So that's kind of how I think about it.
That brings up a good point in my mind of like my team, Alamode. Like our whole strategy was like we're not going to do very advanced, or not advanced, but like very fancy, like super elite level stuff. Like we're not going to go watch truck stop film or pony film and try to emulate what they're going to do. We're just going to do the basics really, really well. And once you can prove that you can stop the basics, okay, then we've got to advance the strategy a little bit. And I think it's kind of the same way here. It's like before you have to get to all the fancy stuff, like make sure you earn your right to get to that fancy stuff. Make sure you've tapped out on like all the benefits that you can get from doing that. Because like you don't have to go into lifting a ton of weight and getting like, super, super specific on trying to peak like your strength and stuff if like 3 sets of 10 of a basic lunge is still making your legs burn.
Right.
It's like I've heard stuff like that before where people want to do more fancy stuff, and it's like, let's make sure you can just do a single leg squat first. Let's make sure you can do this kind of basic stuff first. So yeah, I think that stuff's really, really important. How would you see it then for like how, I guess, would a player kind of know that they're ready to start taking those next steps of like progressing on to, okay, I need to apply some of these principles of periodization a little bit better?
Honestly, it's when you stop making progress. Once you stall out, and for instance, let's say that we're using the example of the novice lifter who is doing 3 sets of 10 on all their exercises, and they're doing it twice a week, basically the same workout every week for both of those days. They've been doing it for 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe they're starting to get to a point where they can no longer add weight each session, and maybe they're even just feeling really unmotivated to train. That's a great indicator that we need to do something different. And it doesn't have to be dramatically different, but rather than beating our heads against a wall and trying to make progress with something that doesn't even interest us, like just mix it up a little bit. It could either be the rep ranges where maybe we drop it from 10 reps for 3 sets to 6 reps for 3 sets. And all of a sudden you can do a lot more weight for 6 reps than you could for 10. But over time, like it's a really simple and boring progression, but it doesn't have to be boring. You might still enjoy it. And if you're just in there to check a box for strength training, even, which I think a lot of players are, as long as you're making progress, it's worth your while. And so as soon as you stop making progress, you probably want to evaluate what's helpful, what's good. And if you don't know the answer to that, like talk to someone, find this guy in the comments, obviously, or, what is that? The online free consultation. There's all the shameless plug for these sorts of things, but like just talk to someone that knows what's up. Get creative with it. Even if you just are bored with the same exercises and you want to do a small tweak to it, you don't know what's what. Like the internet has a lot of bad examples, but a lot of really good ones too, in terms of how to progress simple lifts effectively.
On top of that too, I think it's good to kind of mention that as much as we come from an exercise background, we know the value in these lifts and like we apply them to Ultimate. I think it's important to know that we talk about this stuff is really, really important, but we know it's not like the holy grail, or, it's what we have to kind of be doing. Like if you're improving in your lifts, but the main goal of getting better at Ultimate isn't improving, I think that's also like a really good sign to know to change things up. Like if you go, say you increase your squat from 100 pounds to 200 pounds and your game is also improving, great. You're getting some benefits from that exercise. But if you go from 200 to 250 and you are exactly the same in your speed and your jumping and everything, well, then that jump to try to go from 250 to 300, it's like, your game's probably not going to get better as well because it didn't in the past. So all you're doing then is just trying to get better at squatting, which sure, if you want to do that, great. Like that's what a powerlifter would do, right? And I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine. But like, if your goal is to use training as a tool to get better at Ultimate, that's probably when you need to reevaluate and be like, okay, my strength increase in the squat isn't helping me. Can probably change the reps. Like you're saying, you can probably change the exercise. So you're not just honing in on the skill of the squat, you're actually getting the benefits from it and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that covers a lot of the points that we wanted to talk about. I think we've got a lot of good info in this show here. I guess before we finish it off, did you have anything else you wanted to say or add?
Keep it simple on the strength training. Strength training can be very complex if you want it to be. Like the topic of how do we structure and periodize a year of training for a sport, like it can be very complex, but it doesn't need to be. And so I think when we look at some of the guiding principles for what makes a well-structured year, I would argue, a lot of it's just the ability to keep playing. So are you continuing to stay healthy enough to play a lot? Are you continuing to stay healthy enough to train? Are you motivated enough to do these things? And when you string all that together over 5 to 10 years, like there's a lot of progress to be made there. And so I think as long as we're staying healthy and we're making progress and we're enjoying it, like those three things together make for a good strength program. And so it doesn't have to be flashy, it doesn't have to be complicated. So like keep it simple. Like the KISS principle really is, it's there for a reason. Yes, you can spend 6+ years of your life in school studying these things, but implementing them is all that really matters at the end of the day. And so, yeah, don't feel as if it's impossible to pick the right things, because at the end of the day, like just picking something very simple that allows you to progress and not get too bored or injured while you're doing it, it's going to be good stuff.
Got to enjoy the grind and know that you're in it for the long haul, pretty much.
Right.
Cool. Well, that wraps up our show today. If you're interested in online coaching or consultations, make sure you check out the link in my bio on Instagram, or you can check out the show notes if you're on YouTube. It's going to be down in the description. Spotify or Apple Podcasts will be down there in the show notes. But yeah, if you're interested in working together, learning a little bit more, make sure you check that stuff out. But until next time, I'm out.
You've been listening to the TOBU Fitness Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on Instagram and YouTube at TOBU Fitness. And to get info on one-on-one coaching and training programs, hit the website at tobufitness.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time on the TOBU Fitness Podcast.